Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. You know how this works. We take a bunch of really interesting material and try to pull out all the good stuff for our listeners' view. This time, we're going deep on Stephen Batchelor's Buddhism Without Beliefs. Not just the main text, but also the forward and all that back matter, the stuff that can really give you extra insight.
Right, and this is especially interesting because we know you already have a pretty deep understanding of this stuff, so it's less about teaching you something completely new and more about looking at things from a slightly different perspective. Maybe we'll even find some little things that you haven't noticed before, even after all your study.
Yeah. It's like taking something you're familiar with and putting it under a different kind of microscope. Today, we're going to explore Batchelor's idea of the Buddha, not as some mystical guru, but as a practical guide to help us understand and deal with suffering. And we'll see how his arguments for an agnostic approach to Buddhism, that's a big one, play out in our lives and how we practice. Basically, we want to give you a really clear and thorough understanding of Batchelor's main points, using his own words as much as possible, and hopefully keep thinking about these core ideas in new ways.
Okay, sounds great.
So let's start with Batchelor's view of the Buddha. Definitely different from what a lot of people think.
Right off the bat, Batchelor challenges that traditional image. He says the Buddha wasn't some mystic claiming to have special knowledge, but a man who challenged us to understand the nature of anguish, let go of its origins, and bring into being a way of life that is available to us all. That's a pretty down-to-earth way to see the Buddha, don't you think?
For sure. And he makes it clear that Buddhism isn't just a belief system. He says what the Buddha taught is not something to believe in, but something to do. So it's not just about thinking about the teachings, it's about actually practicing them in your everyday life, regardless of your background or beliefs.
It's interesting how that resonates even with people who've been practicing Buddhism for a long time. Mark Epstein says in the foreword that the book reminds us not just of Buddhism's true nature, but of our own as well, and it gets us away from thinking of Buddhism as just a religion. He even says, and this is kind of funny, it may not be what he intended, but he has made a believer out of me. That shows just how powerful Batchelor's interpretation is, even for someone like him.
It really is. And Batchelor isn't afraid to stir things up a little. He calls his approach an existential, therapeutic, and agnostic interpretation of Buddhism, and he knows it might make some people uncomfortable. He tackles those big ideas head on, that Buddhism isn't necessarily a religion because there's no God, that the Buddha was mainly focused on healing existential suffering, not being a mystic or savior, and that it's more about action, actually practice, than a rigid ism.
And to back that up, he goes back to the roots, to the Kalama Sutta. He points out that in that sutta, the Buddha was all about personal experience. It's not about blindly believing tradition, scripture, or theories, but about testing things out for yourself. As the Sutta says, do not be satisfied with hearsay, but when you know in yourselves, these things are blameless, commended by the wise, and put into effect they lead to welfare and happiness, then you should practice and abide in them. That puts a lot of emphasis on what you actually experience.
It definitely goes against that idea of awakening being some big reveal of a single absolute truth. It's almost like Batchelor's pushing back against that idea that there's this one ultimate truth, like the deathless, the unconditioned, the void, nirvana, or Buddha nature, and saying that focusing on those might have caused us to miss something really important.
What I find so interesting is how he looks at the Four Noble Truths. He doesn't see them as these set-in-stone pronouncements, but as a guide for action. He emphasizes that each truth requires you to do something. Understand suffering, let go of its causes, realize its end, and cultivate the path. And he makes a point that this active aspect of the teachings, the doing part, has been kind of lost in some later Buddhist traditions.
So instead of just accepting what you're told,
Yeah.
it's about actually dealing with your suffering. It's not about believing. It's about living in a way that leads to freedom.
Exactly. Batchelor argues that liberation is not about intellectual understanding. It's about transforming how we live our lives.
So what does Batchelor say the Buddha's own awakening was all about?
Well, he says it wasn't some mystical download of cosmic secrets. It was the realization of complete freedom of heart and mind from the compulsions of craving. He calls this freedom the taste of the Dharma.
The taste of the Dharma. I like that.
He uses a really interesting analogy to explain this. He compares the Buddha to a doctor. He says the Buddha presented his teachings like a diagnosis, recognizing that there's this universal experience of suffering, then a prognosis that this suffering comes from self-centered craving, and finally a treatment plan, which is to cultivate a whole way of life that leads away from suffering.
That's a really down-to-earth way to look at it. It helps make the teachings feel more relatable and less abstract.
It does. Instead of getting lost in metaphysical ideas, it's about focusing on a very real problem and its solution.
Okay, so let's move to that idea of agnosticism, which is a big part of Batchelor's interpretation.
Yes, he really emphasizes that aspect of the Buddhist teachings. He uses the parable of the wounded man. I think you know this one.
Oh, yeah.
A man gets shot with a poisoned arrow, and he refuses to let the doctor take it out until he knows everything about the person who shot him, their name, their family, what kind of bow and arrow they used, all these details.
But those details don't matter. The arrow needs to come out.
Exactly. Batchelor uses this parable to show how we can get so caught up in thinking about abstract ideas that we avoid dealing with our own suffering. Here's a part of that parable that really gets to the point. Suppose, Molunkiputta, a man, were wounded by an arrow thickly smeared with poison there. I will not let the surgeon pull out the arrow until I know the name and clan of the man who wounded me, whether the bow, whether the arrow. It's like saying, let's focus on what's actually causing us pain right now.
It's such a powerful image, and it's so relevant even today.
Mhm.
But Batchelor says that Buddhism kind of lost that agnostic edge over time. Why do you think that happened?
Well, he says that as Buddhism became more institutionalized, as it turned into a more organized religion, it was natural for certain beliefs and dogmas to develop. People started to expect you to hold specific views about things like the origin of the universe, the nature of consciousness, and even what happened to the Buddha after he died.
So the focus shifted away from that initial emphasis on direct experience and practical application.
That's what Batchelor argues. But he also points out that there have always been people and groups who resisted that trend. He talks about the Indian tantric sages, the early Zen masters in China, the Tibetan yogins, and the forest monks of Southeast Asia. All of them emphasized direct experience and personal practice over strict adherence to doctrine.
They were kind of going back to the roots.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Batchelor's main point. The Dharma isn't about believing things, it's about doing things. It's a method you have to explore and test out for yourself. And the ultimate goal is to understand and free yourself from suffering.
And this leads to his idea of the culture of awakening, right?
Yes. He uses this anthropologist, Sir Edward Burnett Tyler, who defined culture as that complex whole, which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. And Batchelor says that Buddhism, at its heart, is like that it's a complete way of life that started with Siddhartha Gautama's awakening and helps those who practice it to also awaken.
So it's not just about individual practices, but a whole way of being in the world that supports this active engagement with our suffering and the path to ending it. It's almost like a blueprint for a society that encourages awakening, just like those early Buddhist communities did.
Exactly. It's way more than just rituals or meditation.
Which I think is something that gets lost sometimes.
Definitely. And Batchelor worries that if we keep narrowing Buddhism down to just its religious forms or just meditation, it'll lose its power to be a truly transformative force in all aspects of life.
It all goes back to that story of Prince Siddhartha, doesn't it? Seeing suffering outside the palace walls led him to his awakening. It wasn't some intellectual exercise. It was a direct response to real pain. And Batchelor reminds us that those same questions, Siddhartha, struggle with the nature of suffering, the fact that everything changes, and how to live a meaningful life. Those questions are still relevant for us today. So if the Buddha was all about practical solutions, it makes sense that Batchelor would emphasize an agnostic approach. Why get bogged down in abstract beliefs when the focus is on actually doing something about your suffering? It's like we build our own palaces, our comfort zones, to avoid facing the difficult parts of life.
We do, don't we? It's easier to ignore it than to confront it.
But those big questions Siddhartha grappled with, they're universal. They affect all of us. And Batchelor's work encourages us to face them head on, not through dogma, but through our own experiences and practice. And that emphasis on direct experience is a big contrast to some later Buddhist traditions that, well, you know what I mean.
I do. Sometimes things can get a little complicated.
So as we wrap this up, what would you say are the biggest takeaways from our exploration of Batchelor's Buddhism without beliefs?
The main thing is Batchelor's really convincing argument that the Buddha wasn't some mysterious figure, but a very practical, agnostic guide who is focused on helping people understand and end their suffering. He stresses that personal practice and direct experience are at the heart of the Dharma.
And that idea of doing over believing. It's a good reminder for all of us, even someone with as much knowledge as you. It keeps us from getting stuck in intellectual ideas and reminds us to always come back to our own experience.
Absolutely. It leads to a really interesting question, especially for you with your deep understanding. How does Bachelor's perspective resonate with your own experiences and insights into Buddhist practice? Does his focus on agnosticism and practice give you new ways to understand or apply these teachings? It's something to really think about.
And that's what the deep dive is all about, giving you food for thought and encouraging you to keep exploring these important ideas. We hope this exploration of Stephen Batchelor's work has given you a starting point for further reflection and maybe even a deeper engagement with these fundamental concepts.
Me too.
Thanks for joining us.
It's been great.